We still have a lot of speakers and some very distinguished gentlemen in not only the Waco area, but also nationally that will be speaking this afternoon. And we have a gentleman here right now that just cannot be around very much longer. And I'd like to introduce him right now. This gentleman is a PhD. He's a professor at Baylor University. He's the director of the J.M. Dawson Institute. And he is going to discuss the religious implications of the ATF raid. And I think that's something that we all want to know about. Please welcome Professor James Wood from Baylor.
I'm really pleased to be a part of the observance of this day, and indeed the commemoration, if that is such a word, at least a day of remembrance of what happened a year ago. There are others here, and I certainly want to respect some schedule to permit them, so if I may just immediately go and make the kind of statement that I feel is particularly appropriate for this occasion. A year ago, as all of us will remember, for 51 days, the drama of the Branch Davidian standoff in Central Texas was given daily coverage by the media throughout the world. From the very time of the assault on the Branch Davidian compound on Sunday morning, the 28th of February, 1993, by approximately 100 federal agents, during which 4 agents and 6 Branch Davidians within the compound were killed, and 16 agents and an indeterminate number of Branch Davidians were wounded, to the drama's fateful, fiery climax on Monday, the 19th of April, in which at least 86 persons in the compound, including 17 children, lost their lives. The flow of news stories remained constant throughout the world. Daily reports were released by the press, radio, and television, with feature stories, indeed feature cover stories, appearing in the most widely distributed weekly news magazines: Time, Newsweek, U.S. News and World Report. From the very beginning, the confrontation between federal agents and the Branch Davidians provoked, then as now, a storm of controversy and acrimonious debate. It should be kept in mind today, as perhaps even more than during the past year, that the Branch Davidians had not been charged with any crime. The initial assault by approximately 100 armed agents of the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms on the compound, occupied by a little more than 100 Branch Davidians, more than half of whom were children and women, was itself an unprecedented government action in the history of this country against a religious group. A powerful chemical on that last day, used by the FBI on the very final day of the standoff, chemical referred to generally as CS, raised further questions as to the methods employed by the federal government in its assault on a religious community, the Branch Davidians. The fine white powder chemical was blown into the compound for approximately 6 hours. That chemical is banned for United States military use. Indeed, early in 1993, that chemical was banned in Paris by more than 100 nations who took action, including the United States. Indeed, that chemical has been declared by Amnesty International to be particularly dangerous when launched directly into homes or other buildings. One weapons expert, Paul Hovind, charged that he doubted that with the use of CS, that members of the compound had any way possible to find their way out. Exposed to CS, to quote Paul Hovind, I doubt that they would have been able to run and to get the children. Certainly the children would have been out of control. It would be, under any circumstance, a very difficult situation. End of quotation. All the more puzzling was the government's stated purpose for this type of military operation, namely, to issue a search warrant to David Koresh to determine if his religious community, which had no history of committing acts of violence or manifesting hostile resistance to government authority, was in possession of illegal weapons, namely fully automatic weapons. Many have asked, then and now, why was it necessary to have approximately 100 armed agents encircle a religious compound with 3 armed helicopters overhead to issue a search warrant or even a warrant for arrest of the leader, simply the leader, not the group, the leader of a religious community? At the time of the assault on the Branch Davidian compound, relatively few persons outside of Central Texas and members of the families associated with this religious community knew much of the Branch Davidians. But by the end of the standoff, perhaps few could deny some awareness of this religious community, even if its religious identity remained unknown to all but a very few. The armed clash between the Branch Davidians and the ATF rightly provoked widespread controversy and debate, not only throughout the United States, but throughout the world. In some countries resistant to guarantees of religious rights and guarantees of religious liberty, the incident was used as a reminder of what may happen in a nation like the United States, which permits a wide array of religious associations without government certification and government jurisdiction. During the time of the standoff, in registering from Waco at a Moscow hotel facing Red Square, I was immediately asked by the hotel clerk at that hotel, "What is religion like in Waco?" The shock of that tragedy that resulted from the Branch Davidian standoff was compounded for many because it involved a religious community with which they had no acquaintance and was therefore entirely unknown. In the face of the tragedy that resulted from the confrontation between this almost unknown religious community and the federal government, the question naturally arises, for many people still, who were the Branch Davidians? From the beginning, the Branch Davidians, as the Davidians from which they originally held to this a radical separation from the world of unbelievers, and to a radical apocalyptic belief in the imminent second coming of Christ and the approaching Battle of Armageddon. Indeed, it may be said that the Davidians, as well as the Branch Davidians, were a people focused on the second coming and the end of time. This, of course, is not the time or place to review the distinct teachings of this religious community. But I mention this identity because it is right and proper here to affirm that basic to the First Amendment is the guarantee of the equality of all religious communities before the law. Let us reaffirm here today that the First Amendment exists, it serves to protect all religions, old and new, conventional and non-conventional, popular and unpopular, against government harassment, intrusion, and discrimination. Indeed, in the words of the United States Supreme Court, delivered 122 years ago in a very famous case, the court declared, "The law knows no heresy, is committed to the support of no dogma, the establishment of no sect, the right to organize voluntary religious associations to assist in the expression and dissemination of any religious doctrine, and for the ecclesiastical government of all the individual members, congregations, and officers within the general association, that is the religious community, is unquestioned. 50 years ago, similarly, the Supreme Court declared that no agency of the state has the competence or the power to determine, and I quote again the court, the truth or falsity of beliefs or doctrines, or anyone, even though those beliefs may be viewed by outsiders as incredible, if not preposterous to most people. Many of us are here today because we believe that the denial of religious rights and religious liberty to any one group is a threat to the religious liberty of all groups. And the corollary that to abridge the religious right of any one religious adherent is to imperil the rights of all religious adherents. For this reason, if for no other, no religion can be denied the protection of the First Amendment simply because its beliefs are non-conventional or even socially at variance with the religious majority. In the first real church-state decision of the United States Supreme Court on the religion clauses, 1878, the court looked to one of its founding fathers, James Madison, the architect of the First Amendment. And the court noted that in the preamble of James Madison's memorial and remonstrance, religious freedom is there defined. And after recital of the act of James Madison, the court went on to say that to suffer the civil magistrate to intrude his powers into the field of religious opinion and to restrain the profession or propagation of principles on the supposition of their ill tendency is a dangerous fallacy which at once destroys religious liberty. The court continued, it is time enough for the rightful purposes of civil government for its officers to interfere when principles break out into overt acts against peace and good order. In these two sentences, the court declared, is found the true distinction between what properly belongs to the church and what properly belongs to the state. End of quotation. There are surely lessons to be learned from the tragedy of the Branch Davidian standoff. First and foremost, there is a need for government agencies to take seriously and to try to understand religious beliefs held by a religious group whenever they may be brought into any kind of church-state confrontation, particularly where there is the potential use of force that may be involved. The principle is one that must be applied even when to outsiders the beliefs of any given religious group may appear to be, as I've said earlier, incredible or even preposterous. Government agencies would do well not to rely, as they did in the case of the Branch Davidians, on so-called cult experts and deprogrammers whose one purpose is to discredit the religious claims of non-conventional and unpopular religious groups and thereby promote religious intolerance and religious discrimination against them. Last year, living in this community, I was more than offended. I was incensed by the repeated references in the press and the media at large to members of the Cult Awareness Network, CAN, and portraying them as experts to the newer and non-conventional religions of America. Indeed, to call members of that network experts, I would say, is both misleading and deplorable. The fact is that members of the Cult Awareness Network have a history of persecution of members of groups they deem to be, quote, cults. Actions of federal agencies from the beginning confirmed for the Branch Davidians their adversarial relationship with the outside world, fueled even further by their strong belief that the end of time and the Battle of Armageddon are near. The precipitous action of the ATF in its raid on the compound not only raised serious constitutional questions about the abuse of federal authority, but proved, as we know, to be counterproductive. In fact, it may well be argued that the actions of the ATF and the FBI provoked a radical response in view of the very beliefs of the Branch Davidians. Since David Koresh was looked upon as the Messiah by his followers, as one professor observed, to come out with your hands up is not what a Messiah is supposed to do. There was little indication that government officials either understood or took seriously the beliefs and religious claims of the Branch Davidians. In any event, merely to suspect a religious group to be in violation of firearms laws cannot justify the severity with which the government acted against David Koresh and his followers. As long as a religious group operates within the confounds of civil and criminal law, even though their teachings may be viewed by others as radically non-conventional and even socially unacceptable to the mainstream of society, the teachings and practices of that group are simply irrelevant to their full constitutional rights and their full religious freedom.
Amen.
As an editorial in the Los Angeles Times rightly observed, if the state had intervened elsewhere in the world against a religious group, as occurred here at the Branch Davidian compound, it would have been reported in the United States press and media as an act of oppression. Even, the editorial continued, even if David Koresh were to be judged a maniac, there is no good excuse for what happened. Prattling on about thought control and deprogramming, profiling its leader as a nutcase and his followers as social misfits, simply does not alter the fact. Although there is no attempt being made here on my part to justify violence, in this case, any actions of the Branch Davidians in committing acts of violence against ATF agents, both at the beginning and at the end of the 51-day standoff, far too little attention was given by both federal agents and the media to the circumstances of the assault against a religious group that had not been charged with any crime and had no history of any acts of physical violence. Constitutional church-state issues were virtually obscured by the repeated use of the term cult by both government officials and the media to justify government action against a cult phenomenon. May I pause here to say that the very term cult, which invariably is directed at a religious group other than one's own, and the group with which one always disapproves, has no place in American public law or American jurisprudence, as does not belong in the vocabulary of any public official.
Amen.
The tragedy of the Branch Davidian standoff had hardly come to an end before there were calls for a government investigation of cults. And such a broad government inquiry as that should and must be always resisted. To do otherwise is to raise serious constitutional questions and to ignore the restraint that prohibits government action short of probable cause. Government action against a religious group cannot be predicated upon that group's being non-conventional, and I repeat, unpopular or socially disapproved. Any confrontation between government and any religious community which has no history of acts of violence and is not specifically charged with committing a crime does not warrant military action against that group on any scale. The use of force should come on the part of government only as a last resort. Indeed, these concluding words of a feature article in Newsweek are words with which I would like to conclude my remarks here. Namely, that unless the feds learn to deal astutely and carefully with non-conventional religions, the tragedy of the Branch Davidians is a tragedy that could occur again. Let us all say, never, never again. Thank you.
You know, during this 51-day siege, I came down here to do my show on March the 10th. I was going to do it live from what became known as Satellite City. And while I was in there, a couple of the news media people came up to me and said, the ATF are looking for you. And I said, for what? And he said, they're going to tell you to leave, and if you don't leave, they're going to make us all move back another 4 or 5 miles to where no one will have any view whatsoever of Mount Carmel or what's going here, regardless what kind of cameras we have. Rather than allow the government to get the media totally out of their sight to where they would be able to do any and everything that they wanted to do, which they ended up doing anyway, I voluntarily left. The next day in the newspaper, a TV newsman that was down here was quoted in the newspaper, wouldn't allow himself to be identified, called me a nut and said that I was going to get people killed. Well, as far as I'm concerned, it was the lapdog media that did that, because all they did is sit on their butts here 24 and a half hours a day, and then for 30 minutes went down to a press conference in Waco at the convention center. The FBI and the ATF would get up there and make their little speeches and tell you what a damned person David Koresh was and how idiotic his followers were, what his demands were, that he's saying, let's get it on, you want us, you come and get us. That was nothing more than one simple thing that's called siege mentality. It comes upon some people that are under siege within 2 days, some people 2 weeks, some people 2 months. But eventually what happens is if you're in this siege mentality, you realize you're not going to get out of here alive. So what you want to do is get it over with. So if David did in fact make those statements, that's what it was. It was a siege mentality in which he was saying, come on, you want to kill me, you're going to kill me anyway, why don't you start doing it right now and let's get it over with. But the media sat down there at the Waco Press Center, at the convention center, every day for 30 minutes, and then they'd ask Bob Ricks and Kalorian and Royster and the rest of the ATF and FBI spokesmen. They'd ask them stupid, inane questions. Nobody asked any probing questions. Nobody but one person, and that person asked whether this type of action was an indication of the police state that this country is becoming. He was escorted out of there and never allowed back in. The rest of the media sat there waiting for their little doggy treats every day, then came back on television and primped themselves up for their little 30-minute piece that they were going to do on the news that evening. And all they did is sit there and verbatim everything that the government said all of a sudden became fact. They didn't question anything. It was all fact. Nobody believed that there could be two sides to this story. Nobody believed that the government could be lying. I believed that they could be lying. We've proved that they were lying, and they're going to continue to lie. They're not going to stop. This is just a precursor of things to come. Somebody says, well, who's next? Well, I don't know who's next, but after the botched job they did here, they better do a hell of a lot of practicing before they decide to go up to Montana and get Guru Ma, Claire Prophet, Church Universal and Triumphant, because I think personally that they are on the list. And I think Claire Prophet knows it, and I think everybody up there knows it. And I don't think the government at this point, if this is an indication of how good they are at what they do, they're going to go up there and really get their butts beat. We've got to continue on with our program. Thank you. Continue on with our program, and we have a lot of PhDs here today, very intelligent people that know what went on and are not sitting still and saying nothing. just as James Wood just did from Baylor University. I'd like to introduce to you a gentleman, a professor of religion at Texas Christian University, and he is going to talk to us about the concepts of the Free Exercise Clause. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. PhD Ron Flowers. Ron?
I've never been introduced as Mr. PhD before. Thank you very much. My friends, the religion clauses of the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States say as follows: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. We are here today to celebrate or to mourn an event that involves primarily the free exercise clause of the First Amendment. And my assignment today is to talk with you a little bit about how that clause has been interpreted throughout the years since the founding of this nation. I want to say at the outset that I agree with my colleague Jim Wood, my good friend Jim Wood from Baylor, completely in what he said a few minutes ago. In some ways his act is a very difficult act to follow because he said some of the things that I want to say. But I believe these issues are so important that some repetition will bear doing. As we understand what the constitutional freedom of religion means, the Constitution guaranteed freedom of religion means, obviously over the years we have had to look at the Supreme Court, because it is that court which finally has determined the interpretation of those clauses. And so I want to review with you very quickly some of the cases that have formed our jurisprudence, formed our understanding of the law about religious freedom. The first case that I need to mention to you took place in 1879. My good friend Jim Wood said it was 1878, but that's no problem. Reynolds versus United States. In Reynolds versus United States, the issue was whether or not a person who was a Mormon who could practice polygamy. Now, the background of all of this that I want to say to you simply is this. As Dr. Wood pointed out to you, it is simply not the case under our system of law that anything can be done in the name of religion. Even though we have religious freedom, it is the case that it's always theoretically possible that some things can be done in the name of religion that would somehow be harmful to others, to be harmful to one's own self, or to the entire community. And consequently, the cases that I want to talk with you about very quickly this afternoon have to do with the scope of interpretation of the Free Exercise Clause. When may the government intervene, and when must it stay out? And in Reynolds versus United States, having to do with the question of whether or not Mormons could practice polygamy as a feature of their religion, the Supreme Court decided against the Mormons. Brother Reynolds was indeed a polygamist, but the federal Congress had passed a law saying that any plural marriage or bigamy was against federal law, and consequently Reynolds was arrested. And he said, I am guaranteed by the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment the right to practice my married life the way I want to, because it's a matter of religious belief for me. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that, because the law must step in when the practice of religion has the effect of, in this case, damaging the moral fiber of society. And in that case, the Supreme Court laid out a test called the Belief Action Test. In essence, the court said you can believe anything you want to, as Dr. Wood told us a while ago. You can believe anything you want to, no matter how absurd it may appear to others, no matter how bizarre it may appear to the majority. You have absolute freedom of belief, but you do not have absolute freedom of action. And in fact, any kind of action that the government considers to be harmful or detrimental to society can be interfered with. And so the court did not give the government many guidelines, and in fact gave it a good deal of latitude in how it could interfere with religious freedom. And from 1879 until 1940, that's the way the law stood in this country, with the government being able to have a great deal of latitude in when it could interfere with religious behavior. However, in 1940, in a case called Cantwell versus Connecticut, having to do with Jehovah's Witnesses, the court modified its viewpoint on this issue very much. Without going into all the details of the case, the Cantwells were accused of inciting to riot, disturbing the peace because they were preaching their faith on the streets of New Haven, Connecticut. And part of their faith at that particular time had some very uncomplimentary remarks to say about Roman Catholicism. And some of the people to whom they spoke were Roman Catholics. And what happened was that the Catholics had these fellows arrested for inciting to riot and disturbing to the peace. And the Cantwells took their case to the Supreme Court of the United States. And the court modified this belief-action distinction that the court had handed down in 1879 by saying that only when religious behavior presents a clear and present danger to society may the government interfere. In other words, what happened in the Cantwell versus Connecticut case was that the Supreme Court of the United States narrowed significantly and considerably the options that government has in interfering with religious behavior, and it broadened the idea of religious freedom. So it seems to me that one way that one can summarize the Cantwell case is to say that after Cantwell versus Connecticut in 1940, in this country, religious freedom was the rule and government interference was the exception. And that's the way the law remained for the next 23 years, from 1940 until 1963. In 1963, a case came before the Supreme Court of the United States entitled Sherbert versus Verner, which involved a Seventh-day Adventist woman. As you may know, the Seventh-day Adventists believe that the proper day of worship is Saturday rather than Sunday. Mrs. Sherbert worked for some textile mills in South Carolina, and their work week was Monday through Friday, and everything was fine. But her employer changed the work week and added Saturday work, and all of a sudden Mrs. Sherbert found herself in a difficult circumstance because she could not violate her religious belief about working on Saturday, and consequently she went to her employer and said, "Can you modify your work week in some way? I'd be glad to work evenings or modify my own work habits in some way." And the employer said no. And so Mrs. Sherbert had to quit her job. And she went other places to find employment and was not able to find employment that would accommodate her religious activity. And consequently, she went to the unemployment compensation people of South Carolina and said, "I've got to have unemployment compensation because I can't work here anymore." And they said, "No, because you quit your job. Work was available to you. You were not available for work, and consequently, you cannot have unemployment compensation." She took her case to the Supreme Court of the United States. And in that case, the Supreme Court found in favor of Mrs. Sherbert and against the state of South Carolina, and basically said that the clear and present danger test that I mentioned to you a few minutes ago, in fact, is not the test that we will use from now on, but they used rather what is called a compelling state interest test. And the compelling state interest test in a nutshell is this, that any time the government wants to interfere with religion, with religious behavior, it must show that the government, has a compelling interest, that it has a legitimate goal which it must reach, which is so important that it can override religious behavior. And so the Supreme Court in Sherbert versus Verner basically said that the free exercise clause of the First Amendment guarantees the citizens of this nation the free exercise of religion. And although there is the possibility that government may interfere with religious behavior only when the government can show that it has a compelling interest. And that's the way the law stood for the next 27 years. In 1990, in a case called the Oregon Employment Division against Smith, the Supreme Court took a major step back away from the idea of guaranteeing religious freedom. Without going into all the details, it involves a Native American who wanted to take peyote as part of the worship of the Native American church. To oversimplify some, the Native American church uses peyote, which is a mild hallucinogenic drug, as its sacrament. And consequently, Mr. Black, who was an employee of a drug rehabilitation operation, had signed as a condition of his employment the promise not to take drugs. But he went to the Native American church and worshiped with them and took peyote, and when his employer found out about it, he was fired. And he went to the state unemployment people and said, "I need an unemployment compensation." And they said, "No, because you violated the law." And so he took it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, in a decision written by Justice Antonin Scalia, said that the compelling state interest test no longer applies. That any time you have a law of general applicability, the compelling state interest test no longer applies. What that means is that the government did not any longer have to have a strong reason to interfere with religious behavior. That the government had great latitude once again to interfere with religious behavior. In fact, Justice Scalia and his 4 colleagues in the majority opinion of that case went so far as to say that the free exercise clause itself cannot be applied to a law of general applicability unless it is joined with some other constitutional principles such as freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to petition the government, etc. That the free exercise clause of the First Amendment was no longer a freestanding liberty guaranteed to the Americans, to the citizens of this country. It was a major setback for religious freedom in this country, because basically what that decision did was to take us back to 1879 to Reynolds versus United States, which did not really inhibit the government very much at all in interfering with religious behavior. Unfortunately, the Smith case was in control. The Smith case was the law of the land at the time that the tragedy that took place on that hill took place. However, there's good news. And the good news is that on the 9th of November, I believe it was, 13th of November of 1993, President Clinton signed into law a bill called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And the Religious Freedom Restoration Act restores the compelling state interest test. It nullifies, in essence, we hope at least, the Smith case. So that today again, the rule of law is that the government must show a compelling interest before it can interfere in any way, shape, or form with religious behavior. That is a very quick and oversimplified summary of the law of free exercise of religion in this country. I want to point out to you that there are 2 themes that run through this. Throughout most of our history, and this is certainly true today, the burden of proof is on the government that it has the right to interfere with religious behavior. If the government observes the law correctly, which is always a big if, is it not? The burden of proof is on the government to show that it has a legitimate interest that would cause it to interfere with religious behavior. I think that we would all agree, and certainly my colleague who spoke here just before I did made it abundantly clear, that the government in this situation at Mount Carmel did not actually spell out its burden of proof, but acted precipitously and incorrectly and illegally in violating the religious freedom of the people who lived on that hill. But that's one theme. The idea is that the government is limited by the Bill of Rights of this Constitution, that the government is limited by the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment, and the burden of proof is always against the government to show that it has a legitimate interest before it can interfere with religious freedom. The other theme that I want to point out to you simply is this, that throughout the cases that I have mentioned to you and some cases that I have not mentioned to you, the people involved have been the following: Mormons, Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses, Amish, members of the Native American Church, people who have been on the margin of what society considers to be legitimate religion, people who somehow or other have been marginalized by the society and have oftentimes been thought of as being strange or peculiar or perhaps even crazy or kooky. But the history of constitutional law in this country, on the Free Exercise Clause at least, is that it is those people who have been the heroes. It is those people who have been on the firing line. It is those people who have gone to the mat. It is those people who have risked life, limb, and property in order to guarantee for all of us, mainstream religious people, people who do not believe in religion at all, the right to be religious or not religious, and if we're religious, the right to be religious the way we want to be. It is It has been those people that the main society and the media have considered to be the strange, the peculiar, the marginal, who have really guaranteed for all of us the religious freedom that we have. I'm convinced that as the tragic events that took place on this property a year ago become ever more widely known, as more scholarly work is done to try to find out exactly what happened here, the Branch Davidians will take their places with the Mormons, the Seventh-day Adventists, the Jehovah's Witnesses, and the others who are thought of as the people who have done heroic work, who gave their lives, literally in this case, and their property to guarantee religious freedom for the rest of us. And so let us think today and in the week that comes as we observe the tragic events that happened here, that we live in a great country in many ways because we enjoy religious freedom that is unprecedented in the world. And yet we live in a country in which it is possible for the government to abuse its power, for the government to sometimes not live up to the responsibilities that it has to provide a legitimate argument or a burden of proof. Consequently, as our founding fathers said as they wrote the Constitution, the price of liberty is always eternal vigilance. Let us be rededicated by our presence here today and by what happened up on that hill. Let us be rededicated to try to preserve religious liberty in this country and to try to insist that our governmental officials play only the limited role that they are entitled to play by the Constitution. Thank you very much.
Now you know why I called him Mr. PhD. You know, right after we took the break here, I got to tell you something. Right after we took the break here at about 1 o'clock, a news camera came over to me, one of the television stations. I think it was one of the local Waco stations. And he said, "Well, what are you up to?" And I said, "Not much." He said, "Are you working?" And I said, "No." I said, "I've had a very difficult time finding a job since I left KGBS." He said, "Well," he said, "I know what you did there for 51 days, and I know what you did until the day you left." He said, "Would you do it all over again?" And I said, "You're damn right I would, in a minute." I said, because the media wouldn't do it. Somebody had to say that there were two sides to this story, and the media obviously wasn't showing both sides. I said, now you're hearing for the first time here today from people that were actually there when it happened, were in there during the siege, didn't leave until the fire. You're finding out the truth. The trial brought out some of the truth. And I said, but the media still doesn't want to believe it. I said, yeah, I'd do it again. I'd do it again in about a half a second. We heard so many things during those 51 days. We heard that the Branch Davidians were in a very heavily fortified compound, that David Koresh was hiding behind his children. And I read a book entitled A Mountain of Lies, and it's a book about what happened in Ruby Creek, Idaho with Randy Weaver. And in that book there are a number of quotes from newspapers quoting ATF and FBI agents. And those are two verbatim quotes that were also in Ruby Creek, Idaho. Randy Weaver's up there in a very heavily fortified compound. He's up there hiding behind his children. They didn't bother telling us that they had killed his son and killed his wife. But that too came out in the trial. So with any luck, sooner or later, truth will out. Let's just pray that it's sooner than later. You know, there are an awful lot of ramifications of what took place right here at Mount Carmel. We don't know all of what they are, but I'd now like to introduce you to a gentleman that's the professor of religion at the University of Kansas. His name is Dr. Tim Miller. Tim?
If you're lucky enough to have a program here, you'll see a name on there, James Lewis. I don't have one, but it comes on there somewhere, and I am here because James Lewis is not here. He's had an illness problem and wasn't able to make it, which is really unfortunate for all of you, because it would be better if he were here than me. He's eloquent and he knows the territory very thoroughly. 2 or 3 years ago, back before the siege, he believed that alternative religions, slightly unconventional religions, weren't getting a very fair shake in this country. He started an organization called the Association of World Academics for Religious Education with the specific goal of trying to communicate honest information to the general public in place of the great misinformation that seems to be so common. And a group like the Branch Davidians were very much within the kind of thing he was working on. So it would have been wonderful if he personally could have been here, because he has a tremendous wealth of information and I'm sure would be able to tell you far more of interest than I am. I'm going to confine myself to a brief personal story that I think illustrates what in some ways is one of the great tragedies to come out of this, the larger tragedy I would call it. 86 deaths is tragic enough. The whole siege and standoff and destruction, we all know how horridly tragic all of that is, but it seems to me, as bad as that is, there is an even larger tragedy that is ongoing and therefore at the moment even worse. And that is that an awful lot of innocent people are suffering because the American public has become fired up with the notion that there are dangerous people out there that somehow have to be stopped. Every time there's a situation that comes into the public eye in a major way, lots of innocent people suffer completely unjustly. Well, I got interested in that and tried late last summer to check something in that vein out. As many of you know, the Branch Davidians are only one part of a larger Davidian movement that goes back to the 1930s, and there were at various points in their history some divisions into different subgroups of Davidians. And actually, one of them is quite a lot larger than any group ever here in Waco was. They are headquartered in the Ozarks in southwest Missouri, not too far from where I live, a little town of Exeter, Missouri. I'd actually known of their existence for quite a few years, but didn't think a lot about it. Had never gone down to check them out, even though they had a large communal settlement down there and some thousands of members altogether. But after the siege of Waco, you can imagine, as someone who teaches in the area of religious studies, I became quite interested in this question: what is the spin-off for other Davidians? What is going to happen to other people who carry this name, which now carries such dangerous, terrible connotations? So I decided I would like to go visit them as a relatively sympathetic observer and just see for myself, so I could tell people that there's a larger story. What are these people doing? So I wrote a polite, lengthy letter to the president of the Basham Hill, Exeter, Missouri, Davidian Adventist Fellowship. It has a long name, and explained what my purpose was, and I thought was quite, I thought everything would do them good. I thought my visit would be helpful to them, that by being there I would somehow help them show that they are not, because we have no reason to believe there's anything whatsoever out of line about what they're doing. And I expressed that to him. After a couple of weeks, I got a letter back from the fellow who's president down there. He sent me my own letter back, actually, and across the bottom he wrote in one line, he said, "We're very busy, no time for visitors." Well, I thought, now that's interesting. A group with thousands of members is so busy they don't have any time for visitors. And I am not one to be put down easily and quietly, I guess, and I thought, well, any group that big, you just better count on the fact they're going to be visitors. So I'm going down that way anyway. In a few weeks, I'll just go take a look for myself. I'll just drive up and see what they say. So I went down there and found the little crossroads town of Exeter and went into the grocery store, and after some inquiry, found someone who knew where they were and got these elaborate directions. You go out this way and there's this corner's not marked, but you take a dirt road down to the south, and you better clock it pretty carefully. It's about 1.8 miles, and make sure you take the right turn there. And it's one of those kind of classic Ozark windy roads through the hills scenes. And anyway, I went down there and I spent over an hour looking for it. The guy in the grocery store had warned me. He said they took their sign down not too long ago. Well, I spent an hour driving around looking for this other group, and I couldn't find them. And I looked everywhere that could possibly be within the range, I thought. They'd actually, the conclusion is, of course, that they had made themselves deliberately very scarce. They were getting so much hostility just from having that name Davidian that they had basically done their most perfect job of dropping out of view altogether. And my only message here today is that I think that's tragic. There is a larger spin-off. Innocent people are hurting all over the place. Religious tolerance, religious freedom, things that a lot of us think are absolutely crucial to American life, are taking it on the chin. I'm sad to report that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker comes to us from Lamar University in Beaumont. He's a professor of sociology and criminal justice there. His name is Stuart Wright, and Dr. Wright would like to address the justice implications of the Mount Carmel raid. Dr. Wright.
One day after the April 19th fire, President Clinton walked out on the White House lawn and asked the following questions to the press. He said, "Is there something else we should have done? Is there some other question we should have asked? Can I say for sure we could have done nothing else to make the outcome different?" I want to suggest that in the order in which those questions were asked, the answers are yes, yes, and yes. I am at the tail end of a year's worth of research in which we're closing out a book commissioned by the University of Chicago Press. 15 scholars from all over the country, historians, sociologists, scholars in law and in religion, are working on different aspects of the Branch Davidian conflict. And we're trying to work through some of these issues. And the conclusion among my peers is that the series of errors and miscalculations probably could have been stopped or interrupted at any point, and that the final outcome of what occurred was not just one mistake, not just two mistakes, not just three miscalculations, but a whole series of miscalculations that are very confounding to those of us who studied marginal or alternative religious movements. I'll avoid the word cult because I think it's a pejorative term that people use to beat up on groups they don't like. A cult is a group that you don't like. Basically, that's what we're left with in terms of a definition. One of the things I do want to address in specifics is the method of psychological warfare that the FBI decided to employ about 10 days into the standoff. We now know from the government reports, the Justice Department report and the Treasury Department report, that the FBI gave up on negotiations very early on in the whole process. That's confounding and puzzling to a lot of us. During the same time in which the Branch Davidians were engaged in negotiations with FBI negotiators, we successfully negotiated a peaceful settlement in Ohio for a prison riot. And it seems to me that the prisoners got a better shake in the situation than the Branch Davidians got. They were so successful in Ohio, and one wonders why we were so miserably unsuccessful here in Waco, Texas. The psychological warfare tactic, which basically was an option that supplanted, it took the place of in negotiations, I think contributed largely to the outcome of April 19th. If you know anything about psychological warfare and pressure tactics, and perhaps you don't, the idea is to destabilize a group by sending them mixed messages, by confusing the message that is being sent, to basically send them into sort of a mental state of chaos, so that you get alternating methods or tactics or messages of threat and conciliation, coercion and conciliation. So that one day the FBI's attitudes would be very conciliatory, sympathetic rather, apologetic, extending themselves to be friends and ameliorative. And the next day they would be aggressive and coercive. They would send tanks out to smash the cars, the automobiles of the kids' motorcycles and so forth. This was by design. And the result they got was that those inside didn't know who they were dealing with. They couldn't possibly trust those on the outside. They didn't know what to expect from the government. It's not surprising that they expected to be killed by the government. And that is, I think, to some extent, a direct result of the methods that the FBI chose to use. No one has explained to me why they thought that would produce a positive outcome. We know that in some other situations against terrorist groups, perhaps this has been used successfully. One case was cited with Manuel Noriega, but I don't think the analogy or the comparison is a very good one. As Lawrence Sullivan said in his report to the Justice Department, he was one of the panelists out of Harvard who was asked to review the actions of the FBI. He said they totally ignored the fact that this group was religious, that their motivations were religious, that their thinking was religious, that they were a religious group, because the FBI dismissed their religion as a front, as a con, and that basically they were a criminal group who used religion as a front. So we have a logic which has a lot of flaws, which probably helps to complicate the matter, and probably contributed to the outcome, because the group thought themselves to be under attack and to be victims in this situation. Let me say just one more thing, and I'll cease. Nancy Ammerman, who was one of the Justice Department's experts asked to review the actions of the FBI, is a good friend of mine, and right after I found out she was chosen to be on this panel, I called her up and I said, "Nancy, how is it that you were selected? No offense, but I don't really consider you to be an expert on new religious movements or apocalyptic sects or these kinds of groups." Nancy studies Southern Baptists. She has 2 books out, both on Southern Baptists. And I said, either the FBI thinks that Southern Baptists are a cult, or they're not able to make a distinction between Southern Baptists and Branch Davidians. And she laughed and she said, "I'm not quite sure why they picked me, but I got a phone call one day, and Philip Heyman, the assistant secretary, deputy under Reno, asked me if I would participate." And she said, "Well, I don't think I'm really the person you need to talk to. Let me give you a list of people who I know are scholars, who have spent their whole lives studying these kinds of religious movements. They would be in a better position to make an evaluation." And Philip Heyman said, "Well, we're only interested in getting you, and if you're not interested, we already have our own list, and we'll go to the next person on the list." And Nancy said she thought about it for a while and decided that she would go ahead and agree to be on the list, because they would exclude the very people that needed to be on the list. At least she had contact with the people who she thought could be most helpful. And so we talked, and in fact she's got a chapter that will appear in my book, and it's rather revealing about the internal dynamics of the FBI culture. And I can tell you that there's a lot of dissensus within the FBI, sort of an internal warfare between the tactical people who like to go in with guns and solve their problems in military fashion, and those who would prefer to negotiate. And you know who won that internal conflict, the tactical people, and that's why we had the outcome that we did. Thank you.